like these peasants in the Duc de Berry's Book of Hours. With 90% of the population on the land, any development in agricultural technology would affect everybody. And in the 7th century, 700 years before Agincourt, 3 agricultural inventions came, one after the other, to fundamentally change people's lives. The first was a new kind of plough. You see, up till then, the plough in general use had been little more than a digging stick pulled by oxen. It came from the Mediterranean, where it's still in use today in the Middle East, and it was good enough for the job of turning over the light soil in that area. But up here in Northern Europe, it got you nowhere. Soil's too thick. So, when around 700 AD, this came along, it made a very big impression. It had wheels, it had a knife to cut through the sod, and the ploughshare had a curved board attached to it. This new plough would cut through anything. Look. Hey! You see what the knife does? It cuts open the sod and makes it easier for the ploughshare that follows. And then the curved board throws the soil up and away to one side, leaving a clean furrow. With a team of, say, 8 oxen in front of this, you could farm the thick, rich land up here that no earlier plough could ever have done. It was bloody hard work, but it could be done. So by about 900 AD, this plough was opening up the north really fast, clearing the forests, producing more food. And in consequence, the population was rising. Woo! Now, in those days, this would have had a team of oxen up front, not a horse. The plough and the oxen were very expensive. Few peasant farmers could afford the whole deal. So they formed cooperatives, each man bringing what he could. And as they began to work close together, they began to live close together in big groups, villages. That's why villages happened. So the first invention was the plough. The second came towards the end of the 9th century. The situation was that up till then they were using oxen in front of the plough, and if you put an ox harness on a horse, it cuts across under the neck and strangles the animal. The horse collar, that was the second invention, spread the load on the horse's shoulders, and so now you could use a horse. Now a horse will do twice as much work as an ox because it does it faster. So production doubled, and the population rose again. The third invention took them and their horses further afield. Yes, it was the horseshoe. See, with a shoe, you can use a horse in all weathers, over rough countryside, and it'll carry heavier loads further. So now you had a work animal and a transport animal. And by this time there was plenty to transport because they were producing so much, they had a surplus. You see, at the same time as all this, a new crop system came in, the idea of using 3 fields, the 3-crop rotation system it's called. One field is fallow, so the animals can graze on it and drop manure on it. One field is sown in the autumn with cereals, like oats, for example, to feed the horses. And one field is sown in the spring with legumes, peas, beans, carbohydrates, vegetable protein. This was why they dropped the longbow, because when you have enough food to sell the surplus for cash, you've got better things to do on a Sunday than obey the law and practice archery. People went into business, they opened taverns, they even played games. That's why they couldn't find any archers. Nobody was practicing. They were too full of beans. Now, this may look very simple and rustic to you, but what you're looking at is the medieval peasant equivalent of Thank God It's Friday. All the more so because they'd never had one before. A day off, I mean. Thanks to the agricultural revolution and the opening up of new land with the plough, there were actually spare goodies a peasant could take to market and sell for that amazing new stuff, money. All over Europe, the medieval lower classes started doing something absolutely unheard of. They started enjoying themselves. Some of them even started washing. The reason for all this dynamic activity was because as Europe recovered from the chaos and confusion of the 10th century, prosperity, if I could just have your attention for a moment, prosperity encouraged trade, and merchants began to travel around selling anything they could get people to buy. Between 1150 and 1300, the population tripled. Towns grew up. So did the number of craftsmen and professions. And so did the paperwork and the bureaucracy. If you think about it, these must have been great days for most of them. Cash to buy things with, paying the landlord rent instead of forced labor, justice, perhaps, at the new village law courts, even a little personalized medical treatment. It may have been a bit rough, but it was better than nothing. Well, almost. Okay, so a peasant couldn't get to be a prince, but he could expect his kids to grow up to a better life. Meanwhile, as the rustic rollicking continued, in the king's palace, it was lead balloon time. I mean, here were all these hayseeds committing the unforgivable sin of not doing their duty, which was to work till they dropped and practice the longbow on Sundays. Remember the longbow? It took a lot of practice to make a good archer who'd go out and get himself slaughtered for you, and these idiots weren't getting the practice. It began to look to the kings and princes as if you couldn't go out and have yourself a nice old-fashioned war anymore. And then good old human ingenuity came up with a less demanding way to kill people. Now, to be fair to the Europeans, they didn't actually invent it, but they took to its immense destructive potential with all the gay abandon of an alcoholic in a brewery. And in case you're wondering why I'm telling you all this with my pig friends here, it's because one of the first places they found the principal ingredient for the new terror weapon was in a pigsty. Why? Well, you see, a pig's home is also his toilet, and you make gunpowder from urine and dung. Using that kind of muck to get to this lethal powder involved going through a bit of chemistry first. The urine became ammonia, and the bacteria in the dung turned the ammonia into a nitrate. Having mixed the mess with wood ash and then filtered water through it all, boiling that water produced saltpeter crystals. This powder is a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. All you do now is apply a flame, stand very far back, and gunpowder was a Chinese invention, and they had it maybe 700 years before we in the West got our hands on it. And it's very probable we only got it because the Arabs picked it up in China and brought it back with them, like they did with so many Chinese ideas. It's very likely that whoever it was who invented gunpowder, he was one of their philosopher-chemists, actually searching for the secret recipe for immortality. Ironic, isn't it? Apart from the odd rocket or grenade, that was how the Chinese used their gunpowder, for fireworks in religious rituals. Which brings us, for a minute or two, to the business about the Chinese inventing everything, and yet not using it the way we did. This is part of the reason, their view of life. The thing that surprises us in the West, because we use everything we can get hold of to cause change to happen, is that the Chinese had so much, and changed so little? What I mean by so much is this. They had gunpowder, you saw, and look what we did with that. And then 2,000 years ago, they used to spin magnetic spoons on pictures of the earth and the sky, and depending which way the spoon pointed when it stopped, they made a political prediction. When we got hold of that in the form of the compass needle, we used it to conquer the world, to set up empires, aided in our voyages by a Chinese rudder. Chinese looms, capable of making complex patterns like that, helped to set up the great 13th century European textile industries. 1,000 years before us, the Chinese had blast furnaces, steel, pistons, cranks, and this, paper. Part of the reason why, in spite of all this, change didn't come in China the way it did when all this came to the West was this. Not printing, although they invented that too. No, this word. Tao. Tao. It means the universal way, the fundamental order of nature. The Taoist scholars were a group who looked for some rational order in things, to see how the universe worked. And because of their investigations, gave China what we would call technology. And yet, explosive change, the kind we in the West went through when we got hold of what China had invented, didn't happen here. And to explain why, I'm going to have to hit you with a bit more of inscrutable Chinese philosophy. You see, the Chinese believed that the universe was filled with Shen, a spirit that was in everything, and that all you could do was contemplate it. Trees, mountains, birds, rivers were all one, and so you couldn't reproduce a model of the bit of the universe and examine it because you couldn't fill it with Shen. Now, in the Christian West, we reckoned that the universe was made of rational bits and pieces by a rational God, and if you were a rational human being, you could make a model of a bit of the universe and then take it apart to see how it worked and use what you learned. The other fundamental reason why change didn't happen here in China was that, water. You see, about 5,000 years ago, the very first great civilized act of the Chinese was irrigation on a vast scale. And that needed centralized planning, and that needed a bureaucracy. And what a bureaucracy. They pigeonholed everybody, and you stayed in your pigeonhole. I mean, you were a merchant, you saw a bit of technology, and you thought, ha, this'll give me a lead over the other fella, I'll rise in the world. No way. You were not permitted to rise in the world. So you didn't bother. No incentive, no change. Whereas in the medieval West, you had a little money, you got ahead. Profit motive, you know? And that is why we were able to do with technology what the Chinese could never have done. Like, for instance, putting gunpowder into one of these. Or to be more accurate, one of those. The fact that bell making was a peaceful religious business didn't stop 13th century Europeans from grabbing the idea. Look how easy it was to adapt. And the bell becomes a bombard, instant artillery. For the princes and generals, happily, it was business as usual once more. This picturesque little town, called Cividale, near the Yugoslav border, was one of the first places where the exciting new way of killing people was tried out in 1327 by a bunch of passing Germans. Now, early on, the new guns made more bang and smoke than real destruction, and each cannon could only be fired about 10 times a day. But a mere mention that guns were on their way was enough to make a town surrender. Well, what more could you ask? In no time at all, everybody wanted one to play with. Which is why our story brings us here, to a place called Yakimov, in the mountains of northern Czechoslovakia. It was the growing mania everybody had for cannons that built this place and turned it into the 16th century Fort Knox of Europe. You see, few inventions have ever been more greedily seized on than the cannon. And in consequence, the business of making war became ruinously expensive. Not in terms of men, they were cheap, in terms of money. And all the way through the late Middle Ages, that was the one thing that they were short of, cash. Until in 1516, here in Joachimsthal, as it was called at the time, the biggest silver strike in history was made out there in the valley. At its peak, Joachimsthal was turning out something like 3 million ounces of pure silver a year. And they were minting these here in this building as fast as the stamping machines would make them. They were called after a shortened form of the name of the town, Joachimsthal, thalers. The modern word dollar comes from thaler. And just like the dollar today, in their time, these thalers would buy you anything you wanted, anywhere you went. Well, you can guess what happened. From all over Europe, miners and speculators flooded into this place, seeking their fortune up there among the pine trees. In these mountains, the prospectors found no less than 134 separate silver veins, each one richer in the precious ore than the last. Some of the mines had tunnels running 7 miles long and shafts going down to 1,200 feet. The cost of the mining operations and water-powered machinery to crush the ore and smelt it was so great that no one individual could afford it. So Joachimsthal became the first great capitalist venture, with shareholders forming companies to run the place. And as the water flowed, the mill wheels roared and the hammers pounded, the owners of these lonely mountain mining villages made money hand over fist.